In this video, I'm going to discuss light attributes. Attributes are basically settings. Now, so far, we've created lights and positioned them in the view panels, but we haven't changed the settings. So how do you go to the attributes? We can select a light like the spotlight and go to the attribute editor. You can use the tab along the right side of your screen or press Ctrl-A. In any case, when you have a light selected, the attribute editor opens straight up to the shape tab for the light. And the shape node for the light carries all the various attributes. So I'm going to talk about some of the critical attributes that lights share. So looking down the attribute list, underneath type, the first attribute is color. The color is set to white by default, but you can change that. Let me do a render first. I'll bring up the render view. I'll render the scene. So there's the white lights with the gray shaded mannequin. And I'm using a mannequin for this demo. You can open up this file if you want to. It's saved in the working files directory within the chapter 7 folder. In any case, you can change the color. If you click on the color swatch, you get the color chooser. While your mouse is in the same area where you clicked, you can manipulate the chooser to pick a different color. You can use any of the handles to pick any color that might be available. So for instance, let's try orange. So once you're happy with the color, you can click off the color chooser or move your mouse off of it, and the color is put into the color swatch. Now when I render this, I have orangey light. Next attribute underneath color is intensity. This is the strength of the light. It defaults to 1, but you can raise this. For instance, I'll enter 2, and the light will become brighter. Now if you raise the value too high, you'll overexpose your model. Eventually it'll start to turn pure white. So you want this value to be high enough to illuminate your object well, but not so high that it becomes blown out and white. So maybe in this case, since I have a colored light, 3 would be good. You can also go below 1 to decrease the intensity of the light. Below the intensity attribute is the illuminates by default attribute. That's a checkbox. This is an on-off switch for light. So if you have more than one light in a scene and you'd like to turn off one temporarily, you can uncheck this and the light is turned off. If you want to turn it back on, check that back on. Below that are 2 checkboxes for emit, diffuse, and emit specular. Specular and diffuse are shading components. Diffuse is the color in the basic shading, and specular is a specular highlight. This is related to materials and textures, so we'll talk about these components in more detail later. But for now, just keep in mind that, for instance, if you want to turn off the specular component, in other words, if you want to force the light not to create specular highlights, you can turn this off. Below those is the decay rate. By default, there is no decay, which means the light goes on forever in one direction. In other words, if you look at the light, you can imagine that if you drew a line from the light out in one direction, the light continues at the same strength forever and ever and ever. That's not realistic. Therefore, you can change the decay rate to some other setting. For instance, you can change that to quadratic. Quadratic emulates what happens to light on the Earth, and as the light decays with distance. So if I set to quadratic and render, you can see the light gets very dim. That's because the light is petered out between the origin and the mannequin. Just that short distance, it's diminished. You can also set to linear, which is less aggressive in terms of decay, or cubic, which is more aggressive. For instance, if I set it to cubic, it's going to be almost completely black. I can always raise the intensity and try it again. So you can see I can use a combination of intensity and decay rate to get the kind of taper in the intensity that I want. Or you can simply leave it to no decay, which means the light goes on forever. So I'll set the no decay and go back to intensity of 2. Below decay rate is a cone angle. Now the cone angle and penumbra angle, which is below that, are unique to spotlights. Now you can have manipulators for cone angle and penumbra angle. You can also change it here. So for example, if I change the cone angle, I change the size of the cone. If I change the penumbra, I'm not going to see anything in the view panel, but I do change the area softness. Now it defaults to 0. Let's try 0 first with a small cone angle so we can see the result. So there's a small cone. You definitely see the edge of the cone. If I raise the penumbra angle to a higher value, I soften that circle, but the cone spreads outwards. So I get softness, but the size of the cone is increased because of the softness. If I go to a value below 0, a negative number, the cone starts to shrink, but I still have some softness on the edge. I'll make an even greater negative number. So I have a greater amount of softness and the cone continues to shrink. So negative penumbra, the cone shrinks inwards with a soft edge. At positive value, the cone spreads outward with a soft edge. And if you want to return it to a hard edge, just put that back to 0. Now below that is drop-off. Drop-off can have a similar look as penumbra, but what drop-off does is it affects the decay of light from the center of light to the edge. So it's not decay over distance, it's decay from the center of the light to the edge. So if I increase the drop-off while penumbra is 0, I will have shrunk the cone inwards. So a high drop-off means that there's a greater taper between the center of the light as the light goes towards the edge. So penumbra and drop-off are two separate things. You can use them at the same time or use them individually. In any case, drop-off defaults to 0. So those are the main options that most of the lights share. Now, not every light has every single one of these options, but lights will have a few of these basic options. Let's take a look at that. Let me hide the render view. Now, what you can do is go back to type, which is the first attribute, and actually switch between light types right here. When you switch between light types, the light changes to that new light. So, for example, I can go to ambient light, and my spotlight goes to ambient light. Now, you see the ambient light has fewer options. It has color, intensity, and illuminates by default, but doesn't have the other things like decay. Now, it does have one unique option, or one unique attribute that the other lights don't have, and that's ambient shade. Ambient shade controls the mixture of omnidirectional light to directional light. Remember, an ambient light has directional rays that emanate from this icon, plus omnidirectional rays that get everywhere in the scene all at once. This defaults to 0.45, but you can change this value to get a different render. Let's render it as is first. That's ambient shade set to 0.45. What you get is a slightly brighter side on the side of the light, yet the backside of the mannequin still gets light because of the omnidirectional component. But let's say we set ambient shade to 0. When I render that, the light is everywhere equally in the scene. So 0 ambient shade is almost like a tune shade. The light is everywhere all at once, equally strong, where it's on the right side or the left side or the back side or the front side. If I change the ambient shade to a high number, like 1, then it's the opposite result. Ambient shade set to 1 gives me a result that's pretty much like a point light. And the point light emanates from a point in space, right here, and is very directional. In other words, I can see that the right side of the character is lit because it's closer to the light, but the opposite side is dark because it receives no light. In other words, it's behind the character, so the point light can't see it. So that doesn't literally change the ambient light to a point light, but makes it function like a point light. So again, if ambient shade is set to 1, you get something that's very similar to a point light. Now you don't have to select 0 or 0.5 or 1. You can select other in-between values. For instance, if I set it to roughly 0.7, what I've done is bias that light towards a point light style of light, but I still have the omnidirectional component where I still get a little bit of light on the backside. So you can set this to any value you want to get the result you want. But again, 0.45 is the default. So ambient shade is unique to ambient lights. No other light has that. Let's go on to the other lights by using the type menu. You can also switch to directional light. You notice the directional light points in the same direction as the spotlight. Whenever you use a type menu, it tries to orient the light in the correct direction. So directional light also has color intensity, has illuminates by default, and emit diffuse and emit specular. However, it has no decay. So directional lights go in one direction forever, and there's no decay on them. If I switch to the next light, then we're back to point light. Point light is very similar, except it adds decay rate. So you can make a point light decay over distance. If I switch to light type again, then I'm back to spotlight. Again, you can see that spotlight is unique that it has cone angle, penumbra angle, and drop off. No other light has that. The very last light is volume light. I'm going to save volume light for another video. Volume lights are very esoteric, so they can be discussed on their own. So in any case, you can change this light menu as many times as you want. Or if you simply want to create a new light, once again, you can go up to the Create menu and choose your new light. Now, there's one other unique attribute that has to do with spotlight. Since we're on a spotlight, I want to talk about that. The no other light has this. If I scroll down and expand the light effects section for the spotlight. Then towards the bottom of that section is something called barn doors. It's off by default, but if I click it on, what happens is I can get a square shape out of my spotlight. In fact, if I reduce my cone angle, make it really small, and render with barn doors, we can force a square shape. Let's try a render right now. So it's still circular, but we have to set the barn door settings. So I still get a circular shape here. What you can do, however, is change these barn door values. And what these are sides, tops, and bottoms for the spotlight to make it have square edges. Now, one slick way of adjusting this is to go to your look-through menu. In other words, select your light, go to Panels, and choose Look-Through Selected. And now I'm looking at my spotlight. I can zoom in here to see better if I want to, or go back and change my cone angle to make it a little bit bigger or smaller. By this point, what you can do is go back and turn on your barn door display manipulator and get interactive barn doors, which you can set in this view. It makes it really easy to force that square shape. So I'm going to go up to Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator, Look Through Barn Doors. And when you do look through barn doors, you'll see that you have these lines that represent the edges of your light. Now, initially, the lines are far away from your circle. Now, in this case, because I had a small cone, they're pretty far away. Now, if you had a big cone, maybe they would overlap, but in this case, they're far away from the cone edge. What you can do, though, is click any one of these lines and drag it inwards. And as you drag it inwards, what you can do is cut off the edges of that circle and force a square shape. So once I click drag all four of those lines, I force a small square shape on the center. So when I rendered this now, I get square edges. In fact, I can make a really small square this light is going to throw. There's a little tiny square right there. Now when I render it again, get a little square patch of light. So again, that's barn doors. So I'm going to back up and talk about the steps one more time. I'm going to go back to my regular perspective view. So you want to use barn doors, you have to select the light, go to the attribute editor. You have to expand the light effects section. To expand, just click that arrow to make that section drop down. It's also called a rollout, so you can open up the rollout. Go down the barn doors, check that on. Then as long as light's selected, you can go up to Panels, look through Selected, and then go to your display manipulator. Now I had left mine on, so it's already there. You can always go back to Display, Rendering, Camera Light Manipulator, and say Look Through Barn Doors. In fact, you can go straight to this and go to your look-through view of your spotlight. In that case, once you see that view, then you can click drag these lines. If the lines are outside your circle, you don't get the sharp edge. If they're inside the circle, you get the sharp edge. Then if you want to get out of this view, go back to Panels and go back to your perspective camera or whatever camera you were using before. So those are the critical settings of various lights. So it's good to take a look at those and change the settings and not necessarily use the defaults.